In this video I have describes the 8 most significant world events in 2022 that will reshape the world future. Future historians may come to regard 2022 as a hinge in history, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Major war returned to Europe, with the attendant threats of nuclear strikes, and the door closed firmly shut on the US policy of strategic engagement with China. Yes, the past 12 months did bring some good news. Most notably, the COVID-19 pandemic eased in many countries. But overall, 2022 brought more bad news than good news. So here are my top 8 world events in 2022. First, Russia invades Ukraine. Sometimes intelligence agencies are like the mythical Cassandra, correctly predicting events only to be disbelieved. Late in 2021, US and British officials began warning that Russia would invade Ukraine. Many European leaders, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, dismissed the idea of war. But on February 24, 2022, Russia launched a special military operation that it said was needed to force the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. To the surprise of the Kremlin and most military experts, Ukraine withstood the initial onslaught and then began to turn back Russian forces. Moscow abandoned its bid to take Kyiv and shifted to seizing the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. In September, the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive that liberated the northeastern city of Kharkiv. 6 weeks later, Russian forces abandoned the southeastern city of Kherson, spurring speculation that Ukraine might seek to reclaim Crimea, which Russia seized in 2014. Russia's invasion exposed significant geopolitical divisions. Second, US-China tensions grow. The great power competition between China and the United States is fully underway. The Joe Biden administration's national security strategy, released in October 2022, made the point bluntly: China harbors the intention and, increasingly, the capacity to reshape the international order in favor of one that tilts the global playing field to its benefit, and the United States intends to win the competition. The administration pointed to Beijing's militarization of the South China Sea, its support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its efforts to intimidate Taiwan, and its rampant theft of intellectual property as evidence that Beijing's behavior had forced the United States to abandon its policy of welcoming China's rise. China's belligerent response to U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August highlighted just how tense relations had grown between the two countries. In October, Biden took a major step to limit China's rise by denying it access to the advanced semiconductor chips and technology essential to dominating fields like artificial intelligence. Biden also continued to urge friends and allies to take similarly tough stances on China. Fourth, climate change intensifies. 40 years ago, when scientists first warned of a possible climate catastrophe, it was a problem for the future. 2022 showed that perilous future has arrived. Once rare extreme weather events became commonplace. Europe experienced record heat waves that burned forests and dried up rivers. Pakistan endured a similarly brutal heat wave that was followed by epic monsoons that left as much as 1/3 of the country underwater. The U.S. Southwest endured a record drought that shrank reservoirs like Lake Mead and diminished crops yields. Fifth, inflation returns. Sometimes the good old days were not so good. The late 1970s are a case in point. Anyone who lived through those years experienced what it was like to see inflation eat through their paychecks. The inflationary spiral was broken only after the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates and triggered a brutal recession. In the 4 decades since then, the world has lived in a low inflation environment. Indeed, for a time the bigger worry for economists was that inflation rates had fallen too low and might trigger a disastrous deflationary spiral. That peril was avoided, but 2022 saw inflation rise around the world. The price spikes were driven by a combination of demand and supply issues. On the demand side, years of easy government monetary policy combined with a flood of government spending to prevent an economic collapse during the COVID pandemic put more money in consumers' pockets. On the supply side, first COVID and then Russia's invasion of Ukraine disrupted global supply chains, creating scarcities in a wide array of goods. Spiking prices have roiled politics in rich and poor countries alike as leaders scrambled to address growing public anger. Sixth, turmoil rocks British politics. It is never good when a prime minister's tenure is measured in scaramucci's. But that was the United Kingdom's situation in 2022. The country whose empire once spanned the globe had 3 prime ministers in just 2 months and also lost the world's longest reigning monarch. The proximate cause for the turmoil at 10 Downing Street was more than 50 members of Boris Johnson's government resigning in July to protest the seemingly endless parade of scandals on his watch. He agreed to resign, and was succeeded by Liz Truss. She lasted just 45 days, or 4.1 scaramucci's, the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister in history. Britain looks to be in a recession with inflation running at 15%, partly because of skyrocketing energy prices in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The bigger problem, and the broader cause for Britain's turmoil, is that Brexit has not produced the economic bonanza that proponents promised. Remainers can say, "I told you so," but a return to the European Union isn't in the cards. 7th. Iranians protest. Regimes born out of protests can also be toppled by them. That reality must haunt the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who in 2022 saw the most significant challenge to their rule since they came to power in 1979. The protests began in September when morality police in Tehran arrested Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman visiting Iran's capital city, for failing to cover her hair properly. She died in police custody. When the news reached her hometown of Saqqez in northwestern Iran, hundreds of people gathered to condemn her death and Iran's mistreatment of women. The protests quickly spread throughout the country as Iranians across social, class, and ethnic lines marched to the slogan, "Women, Life, Freedom." Iranian leaders blamed the United States and Israel for engineering the protests, though the driving force was the government's political repression, corruption, and mismanagement of the economy. The government tried to quell the protests with force. By December, Iranian security forces had. 8th. COVID eases. Pandemics eventually end. 3 years after COVID burst onto the scene, the world appears to have turned the corner on the first global pandemic in a century. In September, the head of the World Health Organization declared that the end of the pandemic is in sight. That reality was evident in the fact that many countries abandoned the lockdowns, travel restrictions, and related measures that they had imposed when COVID swept across the world in early 2020. By late 2022, the Chinese people had begun to rebel against what Chinese officials had hailed as their great success. In December, Beijing began easing its COVID restrictions. However, it had not developed its own highly effective vaccine, refused to import highly effective Western vaccines, and had a population with relatively little exposure to COVID. So the death toll in China from COVID will soar in 2023. Even if China avoids the death tolls that the United States and other countries experienced in 2020, COVID will remain a deadly disease there and elsewhere for years. At the end of 2022, more than 2,000 Americans were dying of COVID each week.